everybody, and thank you for joining us for the third day of Future Laboratory Summit. We have a very special guest with us, Renee Cummings. He's a criminologist and international criminal justice consultant who specializes in a very interesting topic that is artificial intelligence and especially the ethical AI, bias in AI, diversity and inclusion in AI, that is algorithmic authenticity and accountability. Oof, my language is actually going mad now. Data integrity and equity, AI for social good and social justice in artificial intelligence policy and governance. So excuse me, I'm a bit tired today from all of the talks that we had already, but to give you a brief maybe, we started the day with blockchain governance and crypto law. And there we have many different topics from commons and addressing the governance on-chain and off-chain. And of course, data governance and data management is always a huge deal, a huge topic as well. And especially how the crypto law and how the ethical standards are being imposed and who actually takes care of those. So throughout the day, we had different topics, different discussions, and I'm very glad to actually finalize the day with your topic, which is the algorithmic justice. So the floor is all yours. You're going to be having a 15-minute presentation, and then we can open it up to discussion.
Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be with you this morning. Who would think that we would be doing this on a day like today, a Sunday, right? So I definitely want to have a discussion about, are you seeing my PowerPoint? Just let me know. Is the PowerPoint up?
It is up. I can see.
Okay, fantastic. Hold on. Let's just get it so you can see it better, right? Everything's there. So this lab is about data, and it's about surveillance, and it's about surveillance technology and how your data plays into that. And it really brings together this whole concept of artificial intelligence. And now more and more because of COVID-19, because the world is looking for technological solutions to many of the social challenges that we have. In particular, the social challenges that are being amplified by this pandemic. There is a leaning on artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, the lifeblood of AI, is data, and data is powered by an algorithm. So we're going to look at the algorithm, and then we're going to look at how it informs data and how surveillance becomes a conversation that we need to have, and how all of this impacts on individuals, communities, and of course, society. So I'm Renee Cummings, and I am a data activist in residence at the University of Virginia School of Data Science. It's a brand new residency. It's probably the first in the US to have a data activist in residence, if not the first in the world. And what I like to say is I'm not a data scientist, but I am what the conscience of every data scientist should look at. So as we move into this conversation about algorithms, just to ensure that we're all on the same page, an algorithm in its most basic sense is a recipe. It provides inputs, which would be like the ingredients, and the ingredients create a simple, once they follow a simple, well-defined task, create an output. And that output, we say it looks like a meal. So it really gives the computer, the program, an instruction to come up with a particular result. And what is artificial intelligence? Again, AI is using technology to perform cognitive functions that are traditionally performed by humans, and the application of software that mimics human intelligence to perform tasks normally performed by people. So it's a predictive technology that attempts to predict what you are going to do next by mimicking your thinking because of your past decisions, because of the data, because of the ways in which you have been using social media platforms, or the ways in which you've been using technology. So AI delivers real-time solutions at scale, and it is a very powerful technology. It has extraordinary potential, and it has promised great and huge and extraordinary things. Some of the things it has lived up to, some of the things we're just not there yet. But where there is reward, there is risk. And we've got to be concerned. And this is why data is so important when it comes to understanding how that data is used, when it comes to understanding the sociological and technological strategies that are required to mitigate and to monitor bias. And you begin by detecting those biases. Also, I want you to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a strategy to risk management within the realm of algorithmic decision-making systems. And also think about how private interests and public interests come together and the long-term sociological impacts we can see when our data is being used. And just a little more background, words like coding, you're probably hearing a lot of that, machine learning, because they all integrate with AI. And coding is a programming language. It gets the computer, again, because of these algorithms, to behave in ways in which it wants the computer to behave. Every line of code gives the computer a specific instruction. Coding is seen as a document full of lines, and this is called a script, and each script is designed to execute a very specific task. So now you're an expert on algorithms, you're an expert on coding, and you understand what AI is doing. This is something that I want you to think about. This guy right here, Glenn Rodriguez, was incarcerated for several years. And for him to get his freedom, he not only had to face a parole board, but he had to face an algorithm. He had to take the designer of the algorithm, the company that designed the algorithm, to court to win his freedom. And that is how powerful algorithms are. Also want you to think about this situation. The gentleman here on the left, wrongfully arrested because of face recognition. Because this technology, again powered by algorithms, again powered by AI, using an expansive amount of public data, said this gentleman committed a crime that he did not commit. What Robert Williams said is when the police turned up at his house, he thought it was a prank. He could not believe they were using a photograph that looked like him to say that he was the perpetrator of the crime. In the UK, a situation here where a man who was photographed in a public space, and this is where surveillance and privacy comes in a public space, was photographed, and he took that vendor again and the city of Cardiff to task and to court. And you see the situation here with police facial recognition use is unlawful, and the UK Court of Appeal makes a landmark ruling. So wrongful arrests, unlawful use, coming back to the use of your data, coming back to the fact that surveillance technology is all over and it is being deployed in ways in which you have not signed on to. So we want to think about that. And facial recognition is one of the most controversial pieces of technology used at this time. Of course, in the United States, there's been extraordinary pushback, several cities banning it because of the murder recently of George Floyd and the protests that spiraled across the world that was ignited by that powerful Black Lives Movement. We've seen that big technology companies who were developing this technology have also put a moratorium on moving this technology forward. And this is a suite of technologies, facial recognition, that really is deploying the mass surveillance strategies that are now being used. So mistaken match, wrongful arrest, what's happening with your data? It's being used in ways in which are seen as oppressive, intrusive, discriminatory surveillance, being used without your consent, without your knowledge, impacting your privacy rights, your freedom of expression rights, your rights to gather in a public space, all of this coming together to look at civil rights and human rights and how these rights could be eroded by artificial intelligence and technologies such as facial recognition. Some critical themes to think about: race. Because what we're seeing with mass surveillance technologies is that they are being deployed in communities of color. Black, indigenous, people of color are the ones being impacted the most by mass surveillance. Bias, the data sets being used to build these technologies are built on biased data, discriminatory data, data with all different types of prejudices and biases built into it. The concept of secrecy, because what we're seeing with many of these mass surveillance technologies that are being deployed is a fusion of law enforcement technology with national security and defense technologies. We're also seeing that many of the contracts to build these technologies are not being ventilated publicly. There's really no public oversight. Much of the procurement practices are not being blessed with sunlight, in the sense that people don't know what's going on. The monies are coming from different types of funding agencies that are not being documented. And the police in particular, because most of us will come face to face with this technology through policing, privacy. The right to be forgotten is critical as we think about privacy and how your personal data is being used. And of course, how all of this comes to inform your freedom and the fact that someone somewhere is using your data. And not only is that data being weaponized or could be weaponized against you, it can also decide freedom. And freedom is critical when we think about how these technologies are being used in the criminal justice system. So algorithmic justice is a major concept because that is where we're seeing these algorithms being used, new and emerging technologies to give us what we call data-driven justice or evidence-based criminal justice, predictive policing, policing using predictive analytics, algorithmic decision making, and many risk assessment tools. Big data policing is something that we all have to think more and more about, because in every jurisdiction, what we are seeing would be algorithmic policing, where police agencies are using predictive analytics to come up with strategies to reduce crime. Many of those strategies are really continuing a very negative practice of over-policing communities of color. And what we are seeing with the design of these algorithms is that because of the over-policing, what we are just seeing would be statistical definitions being put to criminogenic factors, right? Socioeconomic factors, as opposed to what is indeed criminal. In sentencing, to determine pre-trial detention, bail, incarceration, corrections, offender management, parole, to decide who is going to reoffend or who is not, recidivism, public safety, all of these are now being linked to mass surveillance technologies, because wherever your data is being used in the criminal justice system, it is being linked to other systems, systems being used by the police, systems being used by national security, systems being used by defense. What we're seeing now because of COVID-19 is healthcare data being merged with law enforcement data, and it's something that you want to think about. So when we think about these algorithms, and when we think about how your data is being used, what we're thinking about is risk scores, because what is being designed through these algorithmic decision-making systems are ways in which we can facilitate decision-making with a risk score. And particularly in the criminal justice system, those risk scores are looking at the likelihood of someone to commit a crime in the future. What we have seen with these algorithmic decision-making systems is that they are actually frustrating due process, because they are reinforcing in particular racial disparities because of the fact that much of the data sets have been clouded with systemic racism, a history of oppression and its many and the many ways in which oppression is filtered into the society. We're also seeing these zombie predictions, and these zombie predictions are really these algorithms that are overestimating particular risks. And this comes to the question of what I call color coding in the criminal justice system when it comes to Black and brown data, because Black and brown data is the data that is being used more and more to create these algorithmic decision-making systems in criminal justice, and that is what is being weaponized against Black, Indigenous people of color. So we want to think about the ways in which your data, algorithms are rewriting the rules in criminal justice. And what we're seeing, it's changing the ways in which justice is being administered. And this is when you must ask yourself, if we are using technology such as coding, what would be the code or the mathematical formula or the statistic for fairness and justice? And who decides that? So what we are seeing in criminal justice will be the codifying of bias, discrimination, systemic racism. Inherit the systems themselves, these algorithmic decision-making systems have inherited prejudices of decision makers of the past. And it's reflecting widespread biases that persist in society and continuing or codifying or encoding these patterns of exclusion and inequality. So what started out in the criminal justice system as the need for expediency and to deliver justice in real time has now impacted, compromised equity, public trust, public confidence, and is now raising questions of legitimacy when it comes to the use of these technologies. So for the average citizens, for all of us, when we come face to face with surveillance technology would be every time we step out of our door. And what is being said is once you step out of your door, you have been probably photographed over 40 times before you return home. And you've got to ask yourself, who's collecting that data? Who's using that data? Where are your images? Where is your data? And when will that data be weaponized against you or a member of your family? And this is something you want to think about, policing by AI. Police requests for Google users' location histories have grown 1,500% between 2017 to 2018 and an additional 500% from 2018 to 2019. And I kid you not, I know from 2019 to 2020, the statistics are going to be frightening or even more frightening because of COVID-19 and the excessive approaches to collecting data that have been deployed with the excuse that it's being done for healthcare, but being used in different ways. So when it comes to policing by algorithms, I'll tell you this much. Every time you leave your home and your data travels with you wherever you go, if a crime happens in a particular place in which you and your data were, you can easily become of interest to the police like that. Because big data policing, using facial recognition, body cameras, using technologies developed by private companies such as Ring cameras and neighborhood apps, and think about the Internet of Things, because now your smartphone is connected to your smart home, it's connected to your smart car, and it's connected to everything. So even if you are the passenger in someone's car, your data is now a part of their data. So what the police has been doing of late is going to these big tech companies and issuing what they call geofence, geolocation, or digital search warrants. So they are able to get all the data, and you in a particular location at a particular time when a particular crime happened can become a suspect. And that's something that you need to think about because of the interconnectedness of technology and because of the fact that there are many technologies being used by law enforcement right now when it comes to surveillance, video analytics, social network analysis, sensor technologies, contact tracing apps, and of course, many geofencing quarantine apps that are being used because of COVID-19. So what we are seeing when it comes to surveillance technology would be that privacy is not the privacy that it used to be. Privacy has been redefined. So you can return home, you can close your door, you can go into your bedroom and you can lock your bedroom door. But once you have your phone with you, your data is being accessed. So there is no privacy as we know it. So what we are seeing with these algorithms is that they have become a form of covert operations, particularly for law enforcement. And it's really taking covert policing to an unimaginable level. So we are seeing algorithms now as detective. Algorithms have been upgraded to the point where they have upgraded the concept of an undercover agent. Algorithms are the new plainclothes police officers. And if left unchecked, these algorithms can become very rogue or even function as a rogue police officer would do. So the takeaway here is that you can be digitally cornered by the police in this new digital sphere in which we live without even knowing, because much of the data which is being collected because of mass surveillance technologies and because privacy has now been compromised are being done without explicit consent. So any company that stores users' data and have access to your location history and have access to very granular location history is now an open source for the police. So if you're using a fitness tracker app, if you're using a rideshare app, if you're using a healthcare app, if you're using a contact tracing app, if you are using just about any app, even for shopping, for music, your data is now open access to law enforcement. So what's happening internationally, what we're seeing in all jurisdictions is not only the collection of your data, but in particular jurisdictions, we're seeing this arsenal of algorithmic firepower that's being developed because big tech plus big data plus policing using invisible military surveillance have cornered us. We have been cornered. And the thing about it is that most of us are not on top of this information. What we're also seeing is AI expansionism, which is being considered the digital Cold War. And we're seeing police power and police discretion now digitized and soon to be weaponized, maybe against you. You're not sure. But what we are seeing is that because this technology is unchecked and unregulated, we are creating an extraordinary amount of algorithmic force that is disproportionately being deployed in communities of color. Because what the research has shown us is that when it comes to data and privacy and mass surveillance technologies, people of color are at a higher risk for wrongful arrest, and the anemic laws that exist to govern untargeted access to data is creating the potential for abuse. And individual rights are being eroded daily with relative ease as police, as national security and defense agencies and governments expand their power. So vulnerable communities, and this is why stakeholder engagement, and this is why public education and public awareness when it comes to surveillance and data and privacy is so critical. And this is why we need to take the conversation outside of the academy, outside of groups where we are all discussing the same things, and take it into the communities. And for me, it's about taking it onto the streets. Let's meet people where they are. Because what we're seeing is that new risks are being created for vulnerable communities. And we're seeing how systemic racism operates in algorithms and these hidden biases in algorithms, how these patterns are learned and how they amplify historical and institutional discrimination, and how these racialized predictions that are coming from these algorithmic decision-making systems and these social and political factors that inform technology, how these things are re-victimizing Black, Indigenous people of color and re-victimizing already high needs and marginalized and disinvested communities. So I speak about color coding, and this is a flip on the whole concept of color coding, because what we are seeing right now with these mass surveillance technologies that are very racist in the ways in which they are being deployed and the ways in which they are being designed, have been using certain proxies for race that slip into the classifications: criminal history, financial history, your credit scores, educational background, employment history, neighborhood characteristics in the US, zip code. And these create what we call the hidden effects of algorithms that are creating or amplifying or really bringing a new twist a new, more draconian twist that's impacting things like racial disparities, economic disparities. We're seeing the re-victimization of already high needs communities. We're seeing continued marginalization. We're seeing educational disparities. And all of these are coming together to combine in what we refer to as poly-victimization. And this is very tragic, because what we are seeing is new technologies being used to encode old prejudices, and we're seeing the data in 2020 is very discriminatory, and it comes back to this fallacy of raw data and the fact that no data is ever raw, and that concept of the neutrality of science, where we believe that it is objective. But what we are seeing is that it is not objective. What we need to think about is, how do we balance the power structure of data now? Because we know when it comes to data collection, when it comes to data classification, how data is used, there are power challenges there are privilege challenges, and how it's being interpreted and what is being lost in translation. And now we also have got to look at how indigenous communities are speaking out and using resources to build robust and rigorous data sovereignty programs, because the data is biased, it's discriminating, it's prejudiced, it's really being formed by systems such as racism, and the design, definitions, designations, and distinctions of the data that are being used to create these mass surveillance technologies are creating a lot of atrocities. And those atrocities go back to the black box. And the black box is the box that holds the algorithm. And we've got to ensure that the laws that apply to human decision can be effectively applied to algorithmic decisions, because the data calculation process needs to be interrogated. Predictions must specify the process by which these decisions are reached. So we've got to discuss accountability, transparency, and explainability, auditability, interpretability. These are all concepts that we've got to apply to the interrogation process. The public's right to know, because with these algorithms, many of the vendors who are designing these algorithms are saying it is a trade secret. But what we are saying from a public rights perspective when it comes to technology is that the public needs to know. The public needs to get a look into that black box, because it's not only about public safety when it comes to criminal justice, but it's also about human rights, and it's about civil rights. So political, proprietary, or business concerns continue to take priority. And this is why it is so important for civil society to be on top of this discussion about data surveillance, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. So what I speak about from the perspective of a data activist is the need for transparency, accountability, explainability, accuracy, auditability, and fairness when it comes to the use of data. When it comes to data consciousness, we have got to bring a new type of consciousness to understanding data. We've got to ensure wherever data is used, it is used with proper justification. We've got to think about due diligence, duty of care, due process, sunset clauses if required, because in everything we do when it comes to consciousness and vigilance, we have got to protect civil rights and human rights. And algorithmic justice within the context of data and mass surveillance technologies speaks to the right of upholding human rights, civil rights, racial justice, social justice, design justice, and data justice, which is a big topic right now, and it's one that you've got to get involved in that conversation. And that's where I ended, and I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee. That
Thank you.
Outstanding. I thought you said this is going to be a light Sunday, but I mean, this topic itself is extremely heavy.
It is, and it's a conversation that we need to have, yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I saved a quote that I very much want to say out loud. It's a quote from whom else than Bill Gates. Uh, but I mean, it does kind of capture what you were saying. The first rule of any technology used in a business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. The second is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. And to me, I mean, what you were describing, the tech always resembles the character of its creator. It always resembles all the values that that creator actually has. And what you were describing, I mean, would you agree that the artificial intelligence is actually going to be providing us with a mirror picture? It's actually going to be telling us these are your biases, and now it's up to us. What are we going to do with that picture?
Definitely, and that's a very good way to looking at it. And this is why we're saying that there needs to be a lot of discussions around this technology. And one of the most critical discussions that's happening now would be how do we make the technology more diverse, more inclusive? How do we amplify unrepresented and underrepresented voices? How do we bring these additional voices into the design and development and deployment of this technology? And what are the ethical frameworks? Because I stand right now in the space of AI ethics and being a very powerful voice in that space. How do we really come together with the requisite frameworks that are required to really provide the strength in those guardrails that are required to move us forward as a society? Because we've got to think about the long-term technical impacts the data is going to have on society. And I think one of the things that I'm looking at right now in particular would be the integration of healthcare data and law enforcement data, because so much is being done under the cover of healthcare responses to this pandemic, and data is being collected in ways right now that we're really not paying attention to. And I think for a lot of people, clinical care versus privacy, they may choose clinical care to get that, not understanding what they may be doing when they sign over the rights of the data. So once we've negotiated our way out of this pandemic, you really don't want to look back and realize your data is now going to be weaponized against you, even in a political way that you really didn't sign up for. For a lot of things are very critical, and it's a conversation that we've got to take into the community. Not only a conversation for the AI industry or the data privacy industry, but a conversation we have got to start having even at the the early education level, to build the kind of literacy that's required to really protect the rights that we all have.
I have to ask you because I'm a bit ignorant about it. So far, I actually am aware just of the soft rules being created in this domain, like the AI, the technical standards. Sure, we all talk about it. It's all soft law. It's all guidelines. But are there any hard rules also applied? And I mean, do we have any examples of that?
Well, there are many frameworks, and there are over 100 frameworks that have been designed and deployed. And what we have seen is these frameworks are not only coming from government agencies, but they're coming even from some of the private companies that are creating the technology. It's funny that some of the most robust guidelines are being given to us by some of the companies who have been the greatest perpetrators when it comes to the lack of ethics. But we're also seeing is so much of it is philosophical, it needs to be operationalized. And right now, we've got to take it from the philosophical to the practical. But it's also about encouraging organizations to understand the meaning of an ethical culture, particularly tech companies, and how do you build that? And how do you build that using diversity, equity, inclusion as part of your risk management strategy? So it requires an extraordinary amount of intellectual confrontation at all levels. It requires some face-to-face and very tough conversation that's going to force us to look at ourselves. So far, we're realizing that some of the answers are very uncomfortable and make us really uncomfortable about ourselves when we speak about things like implicit bias or subconscious bias. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, and we need to build, because what we are seeing is that there are many protections that are required at this moment, and we've got to look at how these technologies are being deployed, particularly in the US, which is where I am and the area in which I speak about, against Black, Indigenous people of color. And it's very, very concerning. It's very, very scary at this moment. And there's a certain amount of pushback that is needed at this time.
I am being mindful of the time. We are over time, but I do have one more last question.
For sure.
Beginning of the presentation, you explained that AI is basically capturing the cognitive function. and mimicking the human cognition, right? And with the human cognition, we don't really necessarily mean right or wrong. It literally is just the cognition. And as humans, we always make mistakes. And I'm just curious, how much tolerance are we developing, or are we willing to develop, with regard to the AI making, false positives or false negatives?
So I think this is why collaborative intelligence is so critical, because AI cannot exist on its own. It definitely needs human input. What we're seeing, and I always say, is that criminal justice has got to be the conscience of artificial intelligence, because the number of us, interventions or AI interventions or approaches that are being used in criminal justice. But when you have a situation where you are pretty much facing life or death, or life or freedom versus being incarcerated, these are high stakes decisions that are now being made with technology. Healthcare technology is another area where we're seeing the lack of diversity in data sets really undermining something like precision healthcare. And what we're saying is that we've got to look, you have really got to look at the bias that's baked into these data sets and find ways in which you can distill it, because now your data is moving through your life cycle, your life course with you. And much of what data carries is not only just a computational memory, but it carries a sociological memory, it carries an economical memory, it carries a memory of trauma as well. So there's so much when it comes to data. And this is why in my new role as a data activist in residence, I'm getting the opportunity to explore all of these at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, which is probably one of the most revolutionary data schools right now in the US, because if they could understand the data science needs a conscience, I think the school is on the right track. So there is discussion, changes are being created as we speak. But my passion is we've got to take this conversation in the community.
Thank you for that. I'm actually
Sure.
getting the information that we are not over time at all. We still have
Oh,
5 more minutes to discuss,
okay.
actually, because we are part of the lab. So I would invite everybody to join us in the conversation. I mean, this is an incredibly interesting topic, and I'm full of all the questions. I mean, if you have the time and if we are still willing to kind of debate and discuss these topics, then I'm more than okay to continue.
Sure, it's all up to you. I'm here.
You mentioned being and how they whole thing, and I totally agree with you. All the solutions, sort of, the face recognitions, for example, right, that are being developed by the state. I do see a huge problem of them not being open sourced, or at least not open for the auditing. It's happening the same here. For example, in the time of COVID, the government came up with the idea that they want to have an app developed on blockchain. And I am the president of blockchain think tank here in Slovenia, and I was immediately having discussions with our community, and everything that they said was, well, yeah, sure, let them develop it, but then they should be opening it up for the for the auditing, sorry, not the audition, but for the auditing process, so that we know whether there are some gaps, bugs, or something, and that we know how to address that properly and amend and create a better solution. And with the face recognition, I have the same feeling, and heard you speaking about the indigenous people going with the alternative systems, and especially the data sovereign solutions. Now, when it comes to the data sovereign solutions, I hear decentralization. I hear distributed ledger technologies behind that. And my question would be, can that coexist? Can the state do something centrally and then still kind of have the competition coming from the decentralized world? Or is that like, no, the state is going to continue doing their solutions, and we're going to be a micro community developing our own alternative solutions that are never going to be adopted by the state?
Well, I think it's yes, the state is doing its own thing, but I think for the whole movement of sovereignty is really about activism, and it's about advocacy, and it's about letting the state know that you can't make the decisions you want to make without including those indigenous voices. It also comes back to most countries, and most countries having a census, and governments using the census to collect an extraordinary amount of data on all groups, and then using that to share resources. In the US in particular, you would find Native communities really are not being served by the census because of the difficulty in collecting data from Native communities, let's say in the US. And then these communities are not really sharing in those resources. You would find that the communities are now coming up in indigenous ways in which to collect their own data, in ways in which to look at the kinds of resources. And there's got to be a rethinking of it in that way as well. So I think the Native voices are important because at the end of the day, we know that governments do what governments want to do. And we know that governments find ways to do things, and they find ways to do things with us, our knowing, but without us knowing. But I think powerful voices are critical because what they are able to do is to pull the veil at any time and to say that we are here, we exist, and we have a voice, and we are going to do the things that we need to do to ensure that we have those resources as well. So it's really critical for them to coexist because it's about conscience, and it's about math having a conscience, it's about science having a conscience, it's about data science having a conscience. But I think what's happening now is that because data is something that we cannot see, most people are not understanding what's happening. So they click on social media, they like, they share, they tag, but they're not seeing what's happening inside or behind those things that you are doing. And that's where it becomes very scary because you are sharing an extraordinary amount of data and it's being monetized and it's being weaponized and it's being used, and you are pretty much clueless to that. So this is why these conversations are so important, and this is why we have got to do all that we can to empower civic society. And civic tech also is so critical. Public interest technology is so critical to this work as well.
Would you say, because that's the same question that I posed to Rishi, who's with us on the call, but would you say that you're a pessimist or an optimist when it comes to how we're going to be using the data in the future?
I see it not as either pessimist or optimist. I see it as something that we have got to use. That's something that brings an extraordinary amount of reward, but where there is reward, there is risk. If you drive a car, it is convenient, it is practical, it takes you where you need to go, and you can get a lot done in a car instead of, using your legs in one day, but there are risks. And you've got to learn it. So you learn to drive, you learn to understand the road, you get a certain amount of intelligence the more you drive because of situational awareness. And that's the concept that we have got to bring to data, and particularly AI. It's a new language. It requires a particular level of literacy. It requires certain protections from the state and from government, sort of like the stop signs and where we can go. So you could look at it in that way, but it's something that you've got to live with. It's something that we've got to live with, as is COVID-19 something that we've got to live with. We can't stay in our homes and lock ourselves away from life, and it's part of life. So what it requires is education and awareness and building up your knowledge sets and building up your ability to negotiate the technology. It requires certain protections. It requires an ethical framework for those protections to be operationalized, and it requires us to understand the power of this technology and to self-actualize with it, to understand our own agency and to understand how it's going to deploy, but also understand we have a right to be in that discussion as well.
And do you think that this actually opens up a new horizon for us? I mean, the way we explain these things, it almost sounds as if we're unable to see where it leads, right? You mentioned that we don't really know. It's like a black box. Nobody really knows what is happening with these data. Nobody knows who is using them or how these are being used. But do you think that we will ever be able to have that cognition of that data? And please,
I think we will. I think we will. I think we will, because I think more and more the conversation is happening. There are more and more public interest groups and civic society groups that are looking at this conversation. Universities are now ensuring in their data science track, they have conversations and courses on ethics. I mean, the fact that one university felt the need that they need a data activists in residence. So many things are happening. There are many things that are happening in the academy, in civil society, in offices. I think across, we're starting to look at the question of privacy. It may be new, but it's a discussion that's happening. And I think we are seeing the change. Much more needs to be done in real time. And I think it's going to happen. And I think the more conversations we have, and I think the more of us are educated, and the more of us who are willing to go out there and start to advocate. I always say we have a spirit of advocacy in each and every one of us. Our heart is built on advocacy and activism, and we're all leaders. And I always say, wherever you stand at this moment, you are a leader, and you can take this information and make a change.
For sure. Rishi, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Hi, Renee. Nice to see you.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I totally 100% agree with what you're saying. But here's my challenge. And it's not so a challenge from a US or EU point of view, but it's a challenge from a Africa, South Asia, Caribbean point of view, where you see now the tech companies are coming in to the Caribbean, into these spaces, into these countries, and they're interacting with the government at a particular level and offering these services as a way to quote unquote, and this is the quote unquote they use, security, protection, to help you do your job better. And many of these countries lack the framework, lack the knowledge, or the advocates are they're there, they know, but obviously you still have these despotic regimes and stuff like that. And police force, the army, and the strong arm of these states. How do we now evolve this discussion? It's a pertinent discussion. It's a real discussion that we're facing now. How do we empower those advocates and those people in those countries to be able now to start doing what you are doing?
Well, I think, and you're quite right. And I think what we have seen, particularly, I would say in the Caribbean, because I would say to you in Africa and India, the data ethics movement there is, to me, it's very strong. I think even many of the data ethic frameworks have been called out on the fact that the designers of the framework have been using a very Eurocentric perspective as well. And we're not seeing a more diverse and multicultural. When it's the Caribbean and when it comes to even countries where the voice is not as amplified as it needs to be, I think what we've got to see is we've got to see more of a collaboration between the Caribbean and between ethicists and privacy activists and advocates internationally, really having some of the conversation there as well. But it also comes back to the communities. And I think what we do see in the Caribbean is that the use of technology extremely high. So if we take the Caribbean and let's say Facebook or Instagram, we are seeing people using it. But I think a great place would be in the high schools, because I think that high school generation understands technology, understands the power of platforms such as TikTok and Snapchat. And I think that every high school should have AI/data/surveillance group that is starting to look at those things. So we can't build a conversation only with us, but that conversation has to happen there. So I would say from a data advocacy perspective, a great way to start that movement would be at the high school level, because that is the future of leadership.
Anybody else having any questions? Or maybe an example of data being used against you? Data being weaponized already? Sasha? That to me was very interesting when you gave us an example of how a person was identified on the camera. And it was a wrongful match. Because, I mean, interestingly enough, it happened to me in a store. The security guy actually came after me and I was with my family. It was so embarrassing. He actually took me into the office and said, hey, we need to talk because I have you on camera stealing shit from the store. Okay, that cannot be correct, but let's talk. And it was a footage, obviously not of me because there was a different lady on the footage, but I mean, I never actually thought how much trouble one can go through just by being presented a, a wrong picture. And to me, it was an incredible experience because I know that being a lawyer, you still have that argumentation and you have the techniques, you have the skill sets. But what you're now describing, we really need to collaborate and open it up, or at least find people that can stand for us if we are not able to provide that argumentation to the people.
And this is why future law is so important. And this is why tech law is so important, because so much is changing in the law because of algorithms. And also we're seeing in particular, many of the law schools right now in the US do have a track that looks at data ethics, that looks at algorithms and how the law is changing and how the law needs to really catch up. Because one of the things that we always see would be the law being like, technology being light years ahead of the law. And those loopholes are the things that are the spaces that you would find law enforcement and national security and defense using to create these kinds of technologies that can be deployed. And as I said, without consent and done in ways that are really not above board, but who knows what is happening. And until you become the victim of a digital arrest or a digital subpoena or your data, or you were just in a particular place at a particular time. There was one individual who was riding his bike through a particular neighborhood at a particular time. And then he found out that he was the person of interest in a crime when the police came knocking at his door and saying that, this is the data we have and you were there. So, I mean, these things are really concepts that you want to think about, because as I'm saying, it's most people don't know what data looks like, or we don't know where our data is going to end up, or who is using it at this particular time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then we also say that the data can't be wrong. Because say, well, how are you going to challenge data? If I say, if somebody has a photograph and say it looks like you, how can you now come and tell me it doesn't look like you? Because again, like Renee said, the data is invisible, and then it's not just the data, but the metadata that flows behind it. Because sometimes you can say, okay, I'm giving you my name, my address, my numbers, and everything like that, but there's data behind that you don't see that goes with it, and then with the algorithms that they use it. That's why I think I made the argument this morning. For privacy, you need transparency. I mean, they sound like they go against each other, but they do work hand in hand in that you need to have that transparency in how things are going and things are operating. Because unless you have that, then we have Big Brother coming upon us and and like knocking at your door and asking questions. And then you without that training, we're like, well, how can I challenge the data? Because data is supposed to be infallible when it's not.
And definitely, because we've been seeing cases, as I referenced in the presentation with Glenn Rodriguez, that he had to go to court against an algorithm to win against the parole board. And it really comes back to the fact that these algorithms are considered to be the black box of these systems or these tools or these products. But the fact is that, as the criminal justice system says, we have the right to really face our accuser. And once your accuser is now an algorithm, how are you facing that? Not everyone has the resources to take a big tech company or a startup to court. And many of them are coming to court and saying, this is our intellectual property. This is our trade secret. We can't allow you to go into the black box, but this black box is creating a lot of atrocities. So it's really creating new ways in which we need to think about the law as well. And it's saying that data ethics is really so important. And it comes back to transparency and accountability and explainability, because you need to know how a decision was made and how that decision is being used if something is going to keep you incarcerated for the rest of your life. Right, so it's really important, and it's as I said, it's a conversation that we have got to take to our communities. People need to know.
And by the way, how are the regulations around the lie detector in your countries? I mean, especially in the US, because here we have strict rules that, you can use a lie detector, but you cannot use that as an evidence submitted to the court. And I was surprised to hear that, the algorithms and the data obtained can simply be used and you have an arrest out of that. you could never be arresting a person based on a lie detector. And to me, those two evidences were of the same value, and it obviously is not the same. But he's
Definitely. I think when it comes to the lie detector, I'll tell you this much. Algorithms and AI is really enhancing the lie detector because there's so much being developed with that technology right now. But the other part of it, it's not just the wrongful arrest, it's the confidence in which law enforcement is now using technologies to assist with their investigations, and that is really questionable. But again, there are many agencies, many nonprofits right now in the US in particular and internationally working to push back. You know, internationally there's Algorithms Watch, and then of course there's many other electronic nonprofits that are looking at ways in which technologies are being used and forcing that kind of pushback. Out of LA, there is STOP that has been doing work for many years when it comes to policing and police technologies. In New York in particular, where I am, there are many cases right now that looks at the use of data by the NYPD, in particular coming out of the many protests that happened across the US during or in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and protests. So now if you're protesting, they're using contact tracing technologies and apps and strategies, and they're fusing that with protesters' data, and they're coming to arrest you. They're looking at your Instagram as well, and they're looking at your Facebook, and they're looking at your Twitter account. So I think lie detectors are kind of on the back burner because there's so many other things that they can do before they need to catch you in a lie that they're using to track you. So you know, they're even using your Instagram information to decide what kind of insurance premium you need to pay. So people have got to think about it, and that's why I keep saying it's conversations that we need to have. And as much as we meet someone and we say, hello, how are you? It's almost like, hello, do you know what's happening with your data? So it's that's kind of conversation that we need to have.
well captured. I know.
It's like, how are you and how is your data, right?
Oh, no. How are you? Oh, no, wait. I know already because your data told me everything.
Think about you, right? So yeah, it's real. It's real.
Oh, wow. We have a new participant, SM. Do you have any experiences with the black box, with algorithms, with artificial intelligence, or maybe a question for our speaker? Or maybe let's reverse the situation. Renee, do you have any questions for our participants? Because we could as well go into the breakout rooms and have a bit of that type of a session, interactive session.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, and I think it has been a very heavy discussion. What I would like to say to participants is that there are some great books out there that you can read. I would suggest Kathy O'Neill's Weapon of Math, M-A-T-H, Destruction, Sophia Noble, Algorithms of Oppression. There's also Surveillance Capitalism. There are just a lot of books out there. Pick something up, read something, start to really understand. As much as we search Google for all the fun things and all the entertainment things and all the trivia, Google some of these issues. And if there's a nonprofit next to you, or there's some sort of organization you need to get involved in, just get involved. Just get involved. You know, don't allow this conversation to happen without you. Don't allow your data to be monetized without you having a role in that. Be very careful how it's being used, because you never know when it's going to be weaponized against you. And just be on top of it. And as much as you are on top of your voting rights and your financial rights and all those other things that we have, your democratic rights, be on top of your data rights.
Thank you so much for these suggestions.
Sure.
I definitely want to write down all the book names and then go on to the Amazon, look what's happening. Maybe even transfer myself into the US, because the school that you were talking about really sounds amazing. I mean, that is an exceptional program.
It is. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
It was a great conversation, and thanks again.